All right, well, hey, writers. You've chosen to revise your story today using sensory details and figurative language. So sensory details we've been using really since kindergarten. It's when we use our five senses to help our readers make that movie in their mind so they feel like they're right there in the story with the characters. The best way to do this is by jumping in the shoes of your character and thinking about what your character might be hearing or smelling or tasting or seeing or touching in that moment in your story, and then using precise words to describe those things for your reader. So you might want to think about what your character is hearing in that moment of your story. You might actually want to say how loud or how soft something is. Or you might want to think about what your character is feeling or touching and think about the texture of it. Maybe that's important in your story and add those words into your story. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about what your character is tasting in that moment. And you can choose the temperature words or flavor words to help the reader feel what your character is feeling in that moment. Using sensory details is a great way to show and not tell in your story, so your reader feels like they're right there with your character. Another strategy that you can use is to use figurative language. Metaphors, personification, and similes are all examples of figurative language that you can use in your story. And figurative language is a way for you to bring your story to life. A metaphor is a comparison between two things, and you use the word is or are to make the comparison. So you'll see the example up here. Her smile is the sun. Now, her smile really isn't the sun. You're just comparing her smile to the sun. The idea is that your reader knows how bright and cheerful the sun is, and so they'll be able to imagine just how bright and cheerful the character's smile is. Personification is when we describe non-human things by giving them human qualities. For example, the leaves danced in the wind. Now we know that leaves can't dance, only people can dance. So when we tell the reader that the leaves were dancing, they can imagine in their mind people dancing and then picture what those leaves look like in that part of your story. And finally, a simile. A simile is very similar to a metaphor. It's a comparison between two things. It works the same way as a metaphor, except that you use the word like or as. So you'll see the example. He is as fast as a rabbit. So it's taking something that might be really familiar to the character, to your reader, and then comparing it to this made-up imaginary character. And because your reader is familiar with a rabbit that's really fast, they'll be able to imagine and picture just how fast your character is. So these are great ways that you can bring your story alive. Let me show you how I used some of these strategies in my story about Jesse. So this is scene 4, and this is when Jesse is waiting and waiting and waiting for his cousins to come. And he's just feeling so anxious and nervous and just devastated at this moment because they haven't come yet. And I wanted the reader to understand that he was so anxious and nervous that he was just starting to sweat. He started to just feel so hot. Now I could say that Jesse felt hot, but that wasn't enough because this is an important moment in my story, so I used a simile. You'll see it in the yellow. A wave of intense heat fell over him. He felt like he was in the forge. Now you'll see I used the word like to compare Jesse's feelings and the forge, which is so super duper hot with the flames coming out. If you stood near that forge, your head would be dripping with water. And so I wanted my reader to know just how Jesse felt in this moment. So I said he felt like he was in the forge. So a simile really helped me bring that part of my story to life. In scene 5, this is the climax of my story when his cousins finally arrive at his house. Now he's changed now. He was feeling devastated in the last scene and just so anxious and nervous. And in this scene, he's so overjoyed. So I wanted my reader to really understand just how overjoyed and just how happy he was in this part of my story. And so I used a metaphor, and you'll see it also in the yellow highlighted. The sound of his cousin's voice was music to Jesse's ear. So here I compared his cousin's voice to music. And music is like feel good, and it makes you feel happy and brings people joy. And so by comparing his cousin's voice to music, I'm letting the reader know just how happy and joyful Jesse's feeling in this part of my story. In scene 4, I used some personification. Now, this is where I gave non-human things in my story human qualities. So this is when he was also waiting and waiting and waiting. And I thought because he was waiting for a person, I would give something else in my story, some human qualities. So it would show that he's just so devastated because something happened that he wasn't looking forward to and he wasn't expecting. So in the yellow it says he desperately wanted to hear the sounds of his cousin's horses and see their smiling faces, but all he heard was the wind howling through the streets. So I gave the wind this human characteristic as it was coming down the street because Jesse was really looking for his cousins to come down the street. So you can see how disappointed he would be in that moment to just see the wind come instead of his cousins. So right now I want you to think about your story. Which parts of your story do you want to bring to life? This is probably going to be like an important moment in your story. Maybe it's a really suspenseful moment or a really dramatic part of your story. Think about what you want your reader to feel and see in their mind. And you might want to use a simile or a metaphor to compare something. You might want to use personification to give something in your story human characteristics, make it kind of come alive, or you might want to use some sensory details. So go back to your story, go through each scene, and think about which parts you could bring to life by using one of these strategies.